Arthur Morgan stepped onto the porch of his ranch house, coffee steaming in the morning air. The sun broke over the Arizona hills, painting the dusk golden. He watched his crew prepare for another day of cattle work. Then he saw her. Michan limped toward the kitchen, each step careful and pained. Her usual confident stride was gone, replaced by something broken. "Michan." His voice cut through the morning quiet. "Who did this to you?" She froze. Her back remained turned, shoulders rigid as fence posts. When she finally faced him, Arthur saw what she'd been hiding: split lip, bruised cheek positioned just so, trying to catch shadow from the morning light. "Nobody, Mr. Morgan. Just took a fall is all." The lie hung between them like smoke. Arthur saw the finger-shaped bruises on her wrist, dark purple against brown skin. The way she protected her ribs with one careful arm. The fear that lived behind her eyes now, where confidence used to be. John Marston and Charles Smith exchanged glances near the barn. They'd all noticed the strange riders lately. Men who watched from the ridge line, never coming close enough to identify but never fully leaving either. Arthur set his coffee on the porch rail. Steam rose and disappeared, the way truth seemed to in this territory. Everything important happened in the spaces between words, in the things people couldn't say out loud. "Michan." I said I'm fine. She turned toward the kitchen again, that painful limp making each step look like a small act of courage. Arthur had seen that walk before in the war. Men who refused to admit their wounds as if acknowledging pain would make it real. But this was different. This was survival. The sound of hoofbeats carried across the morning air. Arthur's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, then stopped. 3 riders approached from the main road, badges catching sunlight. Official business, they'd call it. Sheriff Micah Bell rode in front, his pale eyes scanning the ranch like he was already planning how to divide it up. Behind him came Deputy Dutch van der Berg, a man who wore his authority like a weapon. "Morning, Morgan." Bell's voice carried the false friendliness of a snake oil salesman. "Thought we'd check on your cattle permits. Make sure everything's in order." Arthur nodded. "Everything's legal." "I'm sure it is." Bell's gaze found Michan as she reached the kitchen door. "Fine cook you got there, Morgan. Hope she's careful around the kitchen." Dutch van der Berg's smile was all teeth. His eyes lingered on Michan with predatory satisfaction. When he tipped his hat to her, she flinched like she'd been struck. "These frontier kitchens can be dangerous places," Dutch said. "Easy to get hurt if you're not watching where you step." Michan's hand gripped the door frame. Her knuckles went white against the wood. She disappeared inside without a word. Arthur felt something cold settle in his chest. The way Dutch looked at her. The way he spoke about kitchens and being careful. The timing of this visit, right after finding her injured. "Your permits look fine," Bell said, though he'd never asked to see them. "We'll be checking in regular like. Make sure everyone stays safe." They rode out the way they came, dust trailing behind them like a threat. Arthur watched until they disappeared over the ridge, then walked to the barn. He needed to think, and thinking came easier when his hands were busy. That's when he found it. Michan's dress lay behind a stack of hay bales, torn and bloodied. Next to it, a deputy's badge glinted in the filtered sunlight. It had been ripped from a shirt during a struggle, the pin bent and broken. Arthur picked up the badge with careful fingers. He knew that badge. Had seen it pinned to Dutch van der Berg's shirt not 10 minutes ago. The weight of knowing settled on him like a stone. This wasn't just about Michan anymore. This was about power and who had it, about what men like Dutch thought they could take from women like her. Arthur found Michan in the kitchen, standing at the window. She stared out at nothing, her hands working mechanically at preparing the day's bread. When she heard his footsteps, she didn't turn around. "Found this in the barn." He set the badge on the counter between them. Her hands stopped moving. The silence stretched like a held breath. "He said nobody would believe me," she whispered. "Said I was just property anyway, and property can't be stolen from itself." Arthur's jaw tightened. "You're not property. Try telling that to the law." She finally turned, and he saw the full extent of her injuries. More bruises along her neck, a cut on her forehead hidden by her hair. You think you can fix this? You'll just make it worse for all of us. Can't get much worse. Can it? Her voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen exactly how much worse things could get. You think Dutch van der Berg stops with me. You think he doesn't know about Alina at the dress shop, about May at the laundry. Arthur felt the ground shift beneath him. This wasn't about one attack. This was about a system, a pattern of power used to break people who couldn't fight back. How long? He asked. Long enough. Michan wiped her hands on her apron, a gesture that seemed to take all her strength. Long enough to know that fighting back just means more pain. Arthur picked up the badge again. Such a small thing to carry so much weight. In it, he saw everything wrong with this territory, this time, this place where justice bent to whoever wore the star. Maybe, he said quietly, but doing nothing isn't protecting anyone either. Outside, the morning was warming toward another scorching day. The cattle would need water. The fence by the north pasture still needed mending. Life would go on, the way it always did, carrying its secrets and its wounds. But something had changed in that kitchen, in the space between the badge and the truth. Arthur could feel it settling into his bones, hard and permanent as winter ground. The choice was coming. He could see it approaching like weather on the horizon, inevitable and transforming. Soon, he'd have to decide what kind of man he wanted to be in a world that made being decent feel like an act of rebellion. Michan returned to her bread, kneading the dough with steady, determined hands. She'd survived worse than Dutch van der Berg. She'd survive whatever came next. The question was whether Arthur would help her do more than just survive. 3 days passed before Arthur could bring himself to ride into town. The deputy's badge sat in his desk drawer, a piece of evidence that felt more like a loaded gun. Each morning he watched Michan move through her tasks, that careful limp a constant reminder of his own inaction. The choice ate at him. Respect her wishes and stay silent, or follow the burning in his chest that demanded justice. He chose the fire. Tombstone's Main Street baked under the afternoon sun. Dust swirled between the buildings, carrying whispers and secrets the way wind carries seeds. Arthur tied his horse outside Sadie Adler's general store, the one place in town where truth still had currency. Sadie looked up from her ledger when he entered. Her eyes held the wariness of someone who'd learned to read trouble in a man's posture. "Arthur," she set down her pen, "you look like a man carrying more than he can hold." "Maybe I am." He moved to the counter, his boots loud on the wooden floor. "Sadie, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me straight." She nodded. In the territory, straight talk was rarer than gold and twice as valuable. Other women in town. They've been having trouble with the law. Sadie's hand stilled on the counter. Her fingers traced the worn wood grain, buying time to consider how much truth was safe to speak. "Alina Vasquez," she said quietly, "came in here 2 weeks back. Face looked like she'd been kicked by a horse. Said she fell downstairs, but Alina's got the best balance of any seamstress I know." Arthur felt his stomach tighten. "Anyone else?" "Mei Chen. Works at the Chinese laundry." Sadie's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "She don't speak much English, but fear translates just fine. Been jumping at shadows since last month." The pieces fell into place with the weight of stones. This wasn't random violence. This was a pattern calculated and cruel. "It's not just random attacks," Sadie continued. "They're picking women who can't fight back, women who got nowhere to run and no one to speak for them." Arthur's hands clenched into fists. "What about the sheriff? What about him?" Sadie's laugh held no humor. "Bell's got his hands full with more important matters. Rich men's cattle, rich men's problems." The door chimed as another customer entered. Sadie's expression shifted instantly, becoming neutral as creek water. Arthur understood. Some conversations could only happen in empty spaces, when the wind couldn't carry words to the wrong ears. He bought supplies he didn't need and left. The seamstress shop sat at the end of the street, squeezed between a barber and a saloon. Arthur had never paid it much attention before, but now he saw the bars on the windows, the way the door stayed locked even during business hours. Alina Vasquez answered his knock with eyes that expected trouble. She was small and dark-haired, with careful hands that spoke of skilled work. A fading bruise colored her temple purple-green. "We're closed," she said through the crack in the door. "I'm not here to buy anything." Arthur kept his voice gentle, the way he'd talk to a spooked horse. "I'm here because I think we got a common problem." She studied his face, reading something there that made her shoulders relax a fraction. "You're the rancher, Morgan." "Yes, ma'am. Your cook, Michan." Alina's voice carried recognition the way survivors recognized each other. "She's hurting too," Arthur nodded. "I think the same man who hurt her hurt you." Alina's grip tightened on the door. Fear and anger warred in her expression. "You think or you know?" "I know." She let him in. The shop smelled of fabric and thread, honest work and careful craft. Alina moved between the sewing stations, her hands touching tools and cloth in a way that suggested ownership, pride. This was her domain, and she was letting him into it. "Deputy Van der Berg," she said without preamble, "came by 6 weeks ago, said he was checking on business licenses, said I needed special protection being a Mexican woman in a rough territory." Arthur's jaw tightened. "What kind of protection?" "The kind that costs more than money." Alina's voice carried the weight of someone who'd learned that some prices couldn't be calculated in dollars. I told him no. He made sure I understood that no wasn't an option. "Did you report it?" Alina's laugh was bitter as burnt coffee. "To who?" "Sheriff Bell, the man who appointed Van der Berg. The man who takes his cut of every crooked deal in this territory." The pattern became clearer. Not just individual attacks, but a system. A network of corruption that fed on the powerless and grew fat on their silence. "There's others," Alina continued. "Van der Berg's got friends, important friends, men who think certain people ain't really people at all." Arthur thought of William Williamson, the cattle baron who'd been buying up land around town. The man who always seemed to know which properties would become available, which families would suddenly decide to sell cheap and move on. "Williamson," he said, "among others." Alina returned to her sewing, her needle moving with practiced precision. "He wants my shop, wants the laundry, wants every business that don't belong to white men. And Van der Berg helps him get it. Van der Berg makes sure people understand their options." Alina's needle paused. "Stay and suffer, or leave and live." Arthur felt the weight of understanding settle on him. This wasn't about protecting women. This was about land, power, money. The attacks were just tools, weapons used to drive people away from property that other men wanted. "What about the circuit judge?" "Judge Parker." Alina's needle resumed its rhythm. "He's a fair man, they say, but he needs witnesses, needs evidence, needs people willing to stand up in court and tell their stories. And nobody's willing." "Would you be?" Alina met his eyes. "Would you risk your life, your family, your livelihood to speak truth to power? Especially when power's got badges and guns and friends in high places." Arthur understood. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed, keeping certain people silent and certain other people safe. He left Alina's shop with more questions than answers. The sun was setting, painting the sky the color of old blood. In the distance, storm clouds gathered over the mountains, promising rain that might not come. At the Chinese laundry, he found similar stories. Mei Chen spoke broken English, but her fear translated perfectly. The same pattern, the same threats, the same impossible choice between dignity and survival. By the time Arthur rode back to the ranch, the weight of what he'd learned sat on his shoulders like a stone. This wasn't just about Michan. This was about Alina, May, and probably dozens of others. Women who'd been targeted because they were vulnerable, because they were different, because men like Van der Berg knew they could hurt them without consequences. The ranch house glowed with lamplight when he arrived. Michan stood at the kitchen window, watching the road. She'd been waiting for him, though she'd never admit it. "Learn anything useful?" she asked when he entered. "Too much." She turned from the window. In the lamplight, her bruises looked like shadows, dark reminders of violence that lived in the spaces between law and justice. "You talk to Alina. And May. Then you know." Michan's voice carried the weariness of someone who'd been carrying truth alone for too long. "This ain't about me, this is about all of us." Arthur sat at the kitchen table, his hat in his hands. "How long have you known?" "Since it started." Michan poured coffee, the familiar ritual grounding them both. "We talk, Arthur. Women like us, we share information. We watch out for each other because nobody else will. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because knowing and doing something about it are different things." Michan set the coffee in front of him. "And doing something about it gets people killed." Arthur stared into his cup. The coffee reflected the lamplight, dark and deep. "So we do nothing. We survive. That's not enough anymore." Michan sat across from him, her hands wrapped around her own cup, seeking warmth in the night air. "What changed?" "I did." Arthur looked up at her. "I can't watch this happen and do nothing. Not to you. Not to anyone." "And what happens when Van der Berg decides you're a threat? When he comes for this ranch, for John and Charles, for everyone who works here?" Arthur had no answer. The question hung between them like smoke, acrid and choking. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and carrying the scent of distant rain. Storm weather was coming, the kind that changed everything or changed nothing, depending on how deep the drought had gone. "Maybe," Arthur said finally, "it's time to stop being afraid of the storm." Michan studied his face in the lamplight. She saw something there that made her nod slowly, as if she'd been waiting for this moment without knowing it. "Then we better make sure we're ready for it." Arthur spent the next week building his case with the methodical patience of a man laying fence posts. Each conversation, each piece of evidence, each witness statement became another rail in a structure he hoped would hold against the storm coming. Diego Vasquez met him at dawn behind the livery stable, where shadows still pooled thick and words could hide. Elena's brother had his sister's careful hands but harder eyes, the kind that had seen too much and forgiven too little. "You sure about this?" Diego asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sure as I can be." Arthur handed him a leather satchel. "All the witness statements, documentation of the pattern, everything we've gathered." Diego weighed the satchel in his hands. "This gets to the territorial governor, things change, maybe for the better, maybe. And if it doesn't reach him," Arthur met his eyes. "Then we tried." Li Wei joined them as the sun broke the horizon, moving quiet as smoke between the buildings. May's cousin carried himself with the careful dignity of a man who'd learned to make himself small in a world that wanted him invisible. "My cousin, she wrote everything down," Li Wei said, producing a bundle of papers covered in careful script. "Chinese and English. She wants the governor to understand what they did to her." Arthur added the papers to their growing collection. Each document felt heavier than the last, weighted with pain and hope in equal measure. "We take this to the capital today," Arthur said. "All of us. Harder to stop a group than one man traveling alone." The plan felt solid. 3 men, different routes, copies of everything. Even if one of them got stopped, the others would get through. It was the kind of strategy that looked foolproof on paper. Arthur should have known better. The morning stretched clear and bright, the kind of day that made a man believe in possibilities. Arthur felt something he hadn't experienced in years, hope that crept up from his chest and settled in his shoulders, making him stand straighter. He was preparing to leave when John Marston approached, his face twisted with worry. "Arthur, maybe you should reconsider this trip." "Why?" John's hands worked at his hat brim, a nervous habit from childhood. "Just got a feeling. Bad feeling about the roads today." Arthur studied his oldest friend. John had been acting strange for weeks, avoiding eye contact during conversations about the sheriff, disappearing when plans were discussed. The signs had been there, but Arthur hadn't wanted to see them. What kind of feeling? The kind that says a man should stay home and tend his own business. Arthur's hope curdled into something cold. "John, what did you do?" Before John could answer, the sound of hoofbeats filled the morning air. Not the steady rhythm of travelers, but the urgent thunder of men riding hard with purpose. Sheriff Bell led the charge, his badge catching sunlight as he reined in his horse. Deputy Van der Berg flanked him, along with 4 other men Arthur didn't recognize. Too many badges for a social call. Morning, Morgan. Belle's voice carried the false warmth of a snake in tall grass. Got ourselves a situation here. Arthur's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, then stopped. 6 against 1 weren't odds that ended well for anyone. What kind of situation? The kind where stolen cattle end up on honest ranches. Bell produced a folded paper from his vest. Got a warrant here to search your property. Arthur felt the ground shift beneath him. My cattle are all legal. Funny thing about paperwork, Van der Berg said, his smile sharp as broken glass. Sometimes it tells different stories depending on who's reading it. The search began immediately. Bell's men spread across the ranch with the efficiency of a military operation, which told Arthur everything he needed to know about how long they'd been planning this. Michan emerged from the kitchen, her face carefully blank. Arthur caught her eye and saw understanding there. She knew what this was, what it meant, what came next. Found something, one of Bell's men called from the barn. Arthur's blood went cold. He'd hidden the evidence there, thinking it was safe. Now he watched Bell's deputy emerge with the leather satchel, the one containing witness statements and documentation of the protection racket. Well, well, Bell said, examining the contents. Looks like we got ourselves a troublemaker, man who's been collecting lies about good honest lawmen. Those aren't lies. That's for a judge to decide. Bell's smile was all teeth. Course, judges tend to believe evidence over hearsay. And the evidence says you've been harboring stolen cattle and interfering with official investigations. Arthur realized he'd been outmaneuvered completely. Every move he'd made, every person he'd talked to, every piece of evidence he'd gathered had been watched, cataloged, turned against him. Funny how evidence just appears when you start poking around where you don't belong, Bell continued. Makes a man wonder what else might turn up. The planted evidence was obvious to Arthur but would look genuine to anyone else. Bills of sale with forged signatures, cattle brands that had been altered, documentation that painted him as a rustler and a liar. Charles Smith and John Marston watched from the bunkhouse, their faces grim. Charles's jaw was tight with anger, but John looked sick, his face pale as old bone. You boys knew about this? Bell asked them. Charles shook his head. Arthur's honest as the day is long. That's so, Bell's gaze shifted to John. What about you, Marston? You got anything to say about your boss's honesty? John's silence stretched long as a held breath. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. I don't know nothing about stolen cattle. Arthur heard the careful wording, the way John avoided meeting his eyes. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. Well, Bell said, guess we'll sort this all out in court. Meantime, this ranch is under investigation. Nobody comes or goes without my permission. The trap was perfect. Arthur couldn't travel to the capital, couldn't contact the territorial governor, couldn't do anything but watch as his carefully built case crumbled into dust. Bell's men finished their search and prepared to leave, taking Arthur's evidence with them. As they mounted their horses, Van der Berg rode close to where Michan stood. Hope you're feeling better, he said, his voice carrying meanings that made Arthur's hands clench into fists. These frontier accidents can be so unpredictable. Michan said nothing, but Arthur saw her flinch. After the sheriff's men rode away, silence settled over the ranch like dust after a stampede. Arthur stood in the yard, surrounded by the wreckage of his plans, feeling the weight of failure on his shoulders. Michan approached slowly, her footsteps careful on the packed earth. I told you this would happen, she said, but her voice held no anger, just the tired resignation of someone who'd seen this pattern before. I know. You think you're protecting me, but you're putting everyone at risk for your own conscience. Arthur looked at her, really looked, saw the fear that lived behind her careful composure, the way she'd learned to make herself small in a world that wanted to break her. You're not wrong, he said. Then what are we going to do about it? Arthur had no answer. The question hung between them like smoke, acrid and choking. Everything he'd tried to build had collapsed, leaving him with nothing but the bitter taste of defeat and the growing certainty that some battles couldn't be won by fighting fair. In the distance, storm clouds gathered over the mountains, promising rain that might not come. The wind picked up, carrying dust and the scent of change, but change could go either direction. Arthur stood in his yard, surrounded by the pieces of his broken plan, and wondered if there was any way to put them back together. Or if maybe, just maybe, he'd been building the wrong thing all along. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the morning's hope. In its harsh light, everything looked different, smaller, more fragile than it had in the gentle dawn. But sometimes, Arthur thought, you had to lose everything before you could see what was really worth fighting for. The legal troubles multiplied faster than weeds after rain. Arthur's bank threatened foreclosure within the week. His suppliers refused to extend credit. The word had spread through town with the efficiency of wildfire. Arthur Morgan was finished. He sat on his porch at dawn, watching the sun rise over land that might not be his much longer. The coffee in his cup had gone cold, but he kept drinking it anyway. Cold coffee was better than no coffee, and soon even that might be a luxury he couldn't afford. The isolation pressed down on him like a weight. Former friends crossed the street when they saw him coming. Business associates suddenly had urgent matters elsewhere when he approached. The whole town had turned its back on him, and he understood why. Being seen with Arthur Morgan was dangerous now. Michan emerged from the kitchen, her limp less pronounced but still there. She'd been watching him through the window, he knew. She had a way of appearing when the silence got too heavy. "You're up early," she said, settling into the chair beside him. "Couldn't sleep. Guilt's a poor bedfellow." Arthur glanced at her. "You think I should feel guilty? I think you should feel whatever you need to feel." Michan poured herself coffee from the pot she'd brought outside. "Question is what you're gonna do with it." Before Arthur could answer, a rider approached from the main road. Diego Vasquez, but moving careful and slow, checking over his shoulder every few yards. The kind of riding a man did when he thought he was being followed. Diego dismounted near the porch, his face grim. "We need to talk." Arthur nodded toward the barn. Some conversations needed privacy, and his porch felt too exposed now. Inside the barn, Diego's words came fast and quiet. "Alina's scared. After what happened to you, she's thinking about leaving town. Might be smart. Might be, but it's not right." Diego's hands worked at his hat, the same nervous gesture Arthur had seen in his sister. Running away doesn't fix anything, just gives them what they want. Arthur felt something stir in his chest. Not hope exactly, but something adjacent to it. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe you've been fighting this wrong." Diego met his eyes. "You tried to work within the system, but the system's broken. Maybe it's time to work around it." "Around how?" "They think we're powerless because we're alone, but we're not alone." Diego produced a folded paper from his jacket. Names and addresses, written in careful script. All the families who've been hurt by Bell and Van der Berg. All the people who lost businesses, lost homes, lost family members. Arthur studied the list. More names than he'd expected. A whole community of people who'd been suffering in silence. "What do you want to do?" "What we should have done from the beginning." Diego's voice carried new strength. "Fight back together." Over the next 3 days, Arthur's barn became a meeting place. People arrived after dark, moving careful as shadows. Alina came with her sewing kit, her hands steady despite the fear in her eyes. Li Wei brought his cousin Mei, who spoke in rapid Chinese that he translated into careful English. Others came too. Families Arthur didn't know, people who'd been broken by the system but refused to stay broken. They shared stories in the lamplight. Stories of attacks, threats, businesses destroyed, families driven away. Each tale added another layer to the picture of corruption that had been festering in the territory for years. "It's not just Bell and Van der Berg," Alina said during one late-night gathering. "It goes higher. Territorial judges, territorial politicians, people who profit from keeping certain folks in their place." Arthur felt the scope of what they were fighting expand beyond anything he'd imagined. This wasn't just about local corruption. This was about a system designed to concentrate power in the hands of men who looked like him, while keeping everyone else scrambling for scraps. "How do we fight something that big?" he asked. Same way you eat an elephant, Diego said. One bite at a time. They began building a new kind of evidence. Not the official documentation Arthur had tried before, but something deeper, personal testimonies. Detailed accounts of every abuse, every threat, every family destroyed. Stories that painted a picture too comprehensive to ignore. Michan worked alongside them, her presence lending weight to their cause. She'd become more than Arthur's cook in the eyes of the community. She was a symbol of resistance, someone who'd survived the worst and refused to be broken by it. But Arthur's legal troubles kept mounting. The foreclosure notice arrived on a Tuesday, printed on official paper that felt heavy as lead. 1 month to pay what he owed or lose everything. We need to move faster, he told Diego that evening. We're moving as fast as we can without getting people killed. Arthur understood, but understanding didn't make the pressure any easier to bear. He was watching his life crumble while trying to build something new from the pieces. That's when Charles Smith's behavior started troubling him. His most trusted ranch hand had been disappearing for hours at a time, claiming to scout for cattle that had wandered off. But he never returned with useful information about the cattle's location. Arthur began watching Charles more carefully. The man moved different now, with a purpose that seemed separate from ranch work. He received visitors Arthur didn't recognize, men who arrived at odd hours and left quickly. You think Charles is working for Bell? Michan asked one evening, voicing the suspicion Arthur hadn't wanted to speak aloud. I don't know what to think anymore. John betrayed you. Maybe Charles is doing the same. Arthur's chest tightened. Losing John had been devastating enough. If Charles was also feeding information to the enemy, Arthur truly was alone. The next morning, Arthur decided to follow Charles when he disappeared on another of his mysterious errands. He saddled his horse quietly and kept his distance, using skills learned during the war to track without being seen. Charles rode into town but avoided the main streets. He moved through alleys and back ways, eventually arriving at a small house on the outskirts. Arthur watched from a ridge as Charles dismounted and knocked on the door. The door opened to reveal a man Arthur didn't recognize. Well-dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Not local law enforcement, but something else. Something that made Arthur's instincts prickle with warning. Charles and the stranger talked for nearly an hour. Arthur couldn't hear their words, but their body language suggested serious business. Documents changed hands. Money might have too. When Charles finally left, Arthur felt the last of his trust crumble. First John, now Charles. The two men he'd counted on most had both betrayed him. He rode back to the ranch with lead in his stomach and acid in his throat. The isolation was complete now. Everyone he'd trusted had turned against him, and everyone who might help him was risking their lives just by being seen in his company. That evening, Arthur sat in his kitchen across from Michan, trying to find words for the depth of his loneliness. She'd become the only person he could trust completely, and that trust felt fragile as spun glass. Charles is working for them, he said finally. Michan nodded. I figured as much. How did you know? Same way I knew about John. She poured them both coffee, the familiar ritual grounding them in the moment. Men who betray you stop looking you in the eye. Arthur thought about that. About the ways people revealed themselves through small gestures, tiny changes in behavior. About how he'd been so focused on the big picture that he'd missed the details right in front of him. So what now? He asked. Now we figure out who we can really trust. Michan met his eyes across the table, and we stop expecting other people to save us. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and carrying the scent of distant rain. Storm weather was coming, the kind that washed away the old world and left space for something new. Arthur looked at Michan in the lamplight and realized she was right. They'd been waiting for rescue, for justice, for someone else to fix what was broken. But maybe the only way forward was to stop waiting and start building something themselves. The question was what they were building toward, and whether they'd have time to finish it before the storm hit. Arthur's lowest point came on a Tuesday morning when the bank representative arrived with final foreclosure papers. The man wore a suit that cost more than most people made in a year, and his shoes stayed clean despite the dust that covered everything else in the territory. "Sorry about this, Morgan," the banker said, though his voice carried no trace of regret. "Business is business." Arthur signed the papers with hands that felt disconnected from his body. 30 days to vacate the land his family had worked for 2 generations. 30 days to find somewhere else to be. The banker rode away in a cloud of dust, leaving Arthur standing in his yard, surrounded by the wreckage of his life. Everything he'd built, everything he'd fought for, reduced to signatures on legal documents. Michan found him there an hour later, still holding the papers. She didn't ask what they said. The answer was written in the set of his shoulders, the way he stared at the horizon without seeing it. "You can't save everyone," she said quietly. "Couldn't save anyone." "That's not true." She took the papers from his hands, folded them carefully. "You saved yourself, became the kind of man who tries to do right even when it costs him everything." Arthur looked at her, this woman who'd been through worse than he could imagine and still found strength to comfort him. What good is being right if it doesn't change anything? Maybe the changing hasn't happened yet. Before Arthur could respond, Charles Smith emerged from the barn. His approach was different now, careful and measured. The easy familiarity between them had been replaced by something more formal, more distant. "Arthur," Charles said, his voice carrying weight, "we need to talk." Arthur felt his chest tighten. Here it comes, he thought, the final betrayal. The last nail in the coffin of his trust. "About what?" "About who I really am." Charles glanced around the yard, checking for listeners. "About why I've been disappearing. About the work I've been doing that you can't see." Arthur waited. In the distance, clouds gathered over the mountains, promising rain that might not come. "I'm not just a ranch hand," Charles continued. "Haven't been for months. I've been working with territorial marshals, investigating corruption in local law enforcement." The words hit Arthur like a physical blow. "What?" "I couldn't tell you because we weren't sure who else might be compromised." Charles's voice was steady, professional. "But we've been building a case against Bell and Van der Berg for months. Your documentation, your witness statements, everything you gathered has been the final piece we needed." Arthur felt the world tilt on its axis. "You're a marshal." "Was, during the war. Got recruited back into service 6 months ago when reports of territorial corruption reached Washington." Charles produced a badge from his jacket, worn and official. "I'm sorry I couldn't tell you sooner." Arthur stared at the badge, trying to process this revelation. The betrayal he'd been expecting transformed into something else entirely. Hope, maybe, or just confusion. "The man you saw me meeting with," Charles continued. "Marshal Thompson. He's been coordinating the investigation from the Capitol. Everything we've gathered, all the evidence, it's been building toward this moment." "What moment?" "The moment when we have enough to bring down the entire network." Charles's voice carried new authority. "Bell, Van der Berg, Williamson, and half a dozen other territorial officials. We're talking about arrests, trials, real justice." Michan stepped closer, her hand finding Arthur's arm. "This is what we've been fighting for." Arthur felt something crack open in his chest. Not hope exactly, but the possibility of hope. "How long have you known?" "About the corruption?" "Months. About you specifically." "Since the morning you found Michan hurt." Charles met his eyes. "I've been watching, Arthur. Watching you choose to do the right thing even when it cost you everything. That's why Marshal Thompson decided to trust you with this." "Trust me with what?" "With being the staging ground for the final operation." Charles gestured toward the ranch house. "We need a place to coordinate arrests across multiple counties. Somewhere isolated enough to plan without being observed." Arthur looked around his property with new eyes. The ranch that was about to be taken away from him might become the base for the justice he'd been seeking all along. "The foreclosure," he said, "will be suspended pending the investigation." Charles almost smiled. Amazing how quickly banks become cooperative when federal marshals start asking questions about their lending practices. The relief that washed over Arthur was overwhelming. Not just about the ranch, but about Charles himself. The man he'd trusted, lost faith in, and trusted again hadn't betrayed him after all. "What about John?" Arthur asked. Charles's expression darkened. "John's situation is more complicated. He did take money from Williamson, but it was because they threatened to kill him if he didn't cooperate. He's been feeding them information, but he's also been feeding us information about them." Arthur felt the pieces of his understanding shift again. He's working both sides. He's trying to stay alive while doing as little damage as possible. Charles's voice carried sympathy. "Fear makes people do things they never thought they'd do. John's not a bad man. He's just a scared one." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Arthur tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun, but Charles held up a restraining hand. "That'll be Marshal Thompson and his team." 3 riders crested the hill, moving with the disciplined formation of professional lawmen. The man in the lead was tall and lean, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent years in the saddle. He dismounted with the fluid grace of a career soldier. "Morgan," he said, extending his hand. "Marshal Thompson, I've heard good things about you." Arthur shook the offered hand, still processing the rapid changes in his circumstances. "Marshal, I know this is a lot to take in," Thompson said, "but we need to move quickly. Van der Berg's been getting more desperate lately, more dangerous. Our sources suggest he's planning something that could put innocent people at risk." "What kind of something?" "The kind that involves taking hostages to ensure his escape." Thompson's voice was grim. "He knows we're closing in. Cornered animals are the most dangerous kind." Arthur felt cold settle in his stomach. "He'll come for Mitjan. He'll come for whoever he thinks will hurt you most." Thompson glanced at Mitjan, who stood listening with careful attention. "We need to be ready for that possibility." The plan they laid out was complex but thorough. Coordinated arrests across multiple counties, timed to prevent any of the conspirators from warning the others. Arthur's ranch would serve as the command center, with marshals positioned throughout the territory. As the sun set over the mountains, Arthur found himself surrounded by men he could trust for the first time in months. The isolation that had been crushing him was replaced by something he'd almost forgotten, the feeling of being part of something larger than himself. But trust was a fragile thing, and Arthur had learned not to count on anything until it was finished. Dutch van der Berg was still out there, still dangerous, still capable of destroying everything Arthur cared about. "How long before you move?" Arthur asked Thompson. "Tomorrow night. Give us time to get everyone in position." Arthur nodded, but his chest remained tight with worry. Tomorrow night felt like a lifetime away, and Van der Berg was the kind of man who could do a lot of damage in a lifetime. Mitjan touched his arm again, grounding him in the present moment. "We're going to be okay," she said quietly. Arthur looked at her in the fading light and realized she was right. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. And maybe, just maybe, they'd finally get the justice they'd been fighting for. The stars emerged one by one over the Arizona sky, watching over a ranch that had become the center of something much larger than any of them had imagined. The operation began at dawn with the precision of a military campaign. Marshal Thompson positioned his men across the territory, each team responsible for a different piece of the corruption network. Arthur's ranch became the nerve center, with riders carrying messages between locations and coordinating the simultaneous arrests. Arthur stood on his porch, watching the controlled chaos unfold. Men he'd never seen before moved through his property with quiet efficiency, transforming his home into a fortress of justice. The irony wasn't lost on him. The ranch he'd nearly lost was now the foundation for everything he'd fought to achieve. Mitjan worked alongside the marshals, her knowledge of the local community proving invaluable. She knew which roads Van der Berg preferred, which hiding spots he might use, which allies he could call upon. Her insights shaped the operation's strategy. "He's not going to surrender peacefully," she told Thompson during the morning briefing. "Man like that, he'd rather burn everything down than admit defeat." Thompson nodded grimly. "That's what we're counting on. Desperate men make mistakes. As the day progressed, reports filtered in from across the territory. Sheriff Bell had been arrested at his home without incident, caught with evidence of bribery and extortion. 3 other deputies were in custody. William Williamson had fled his ranch, but marshals were tracking him toward the Mexican border. Only Dutch van der Berg remained unaccounted for. Arthur felt the tension building throughout the afternoon. Every rider that appeared on the horizon could be bringing news of Van der Berg's capture, or his escape, or something worse. As evening approached, Arthur found himself pacing the length of his porch, his boots wearing a path in the wooden planks. The waiting was harder than any action would have been. At least in action he could feel useful. "You're going to wear a hole in that porch," Michan said from the doorway. "Maybe. Or you could come inside and help me prepare supper for all these hungry marshals." Arthur followed her into the kitchen, grateful for something to do with his hands. They worked in companionable silence, the familiar rhythm of meal preparation grounding them both in the present moment. That's when they heard the gunshot. It came from the direction of the barn, sharp and clear in the evening air. Arthur's hand moved to his gun, but Michan grabbed his arm. "Don't," she said quietly. "That's what he wants." Arthur understood immediately. Van der Berg was here, had been watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. The gunshot was a summons, a demand for Arthur's attention. Marshal Thompson appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face grim. "He's got Charles, barricaded in the barn, says he wants to talk to you." Arthur's chest tightened. Charles had survived the war, had served his country with honor, had risked everything to bring justice to this corrupt territory. Now he was a pawn in Van der Berg's desperate game. What does he want? Safe passage out of the territory. Fresh horse. Head start before we follow. Arthur looked at Michan, saw his own thoughts reflected in her eyes. Let Van der Berg go, save Charles's life, and watch justice slip away once again. The same impossible choice they'd been facing all along. And if we refuse, he kills Charles, then probably tries to kill as many of us as he can before we take him down. Arthur moved toward the door, but Michan's hand on his arm stopped him. "This is what he wants," she said. "You walking into his trap, you trying to save everyone. I can't just let Charles die." "Then don't." Her voice carried new strength. "But don't let yourself die either." Before Arthur could ask what she meant, Michan was moving. Not toward the front door where Van der Berg would expect them, but toward the back of the house. Toward the old root cellar that connected to the barn through a tunnel Arthur had forgotten existed. "He doesn't know about the tunnel," she whispered. "Been here long enough to know every hiding place, every secret passage." Arthur felt something shift inside him. Not hope exactly, but recognition. Michan wasn't asking to be saved. She was offering to do the saving. "It's too dangerous. Everything's dangerous." She checked the small pistol she kept in her apron pocket. "But I know that barn better than he does. Know which floorboards creak, which shadows hide a person, which corners offer the best cover." Thompson appeared with 3 of his men, all armed and ready. "We can rush the barn, overwhelm him before he can hurt Charles." "And get Charles killed in the crossfire," Arthur said. "No." "Then what do you suggest?" Arthur looked at Michan, saw the determination in her eyes. She'd made her choice, and he realized she was right. This wasn't about him being the hero. This was about trusting the people who'd proven themselves capable of heroism. "Give me 10 minutes, Michan said. "Then make noise at the front of the barn. Draw his attention." She disappeared into the root cellar before anyone could argue. Arthur watched her go, feeling simultaneously proud and terrified. This was what courage looked like. Not the absence of fear, but action despite it. The next 10 minutes stretched like hours. Arthur positioned himself where he could see the barn, watching for any sign of movement. Thompson's men took positions around the property, ready to move when the moment came. Then Arthur heard Van der Berg's voice carrying across the yard. "Morgan, I know you're out there. Come talk to me like a man or your friend dies." Arthur stepped into the open, his hands visible and empty. "I'm here, Dutch. What do you want?" "What I've always wanted, respect, recognition." The understanding that some men are meant to lead and others are meant to follow. By hurting innocent people, by taking what's mine. Van der Berg's voice carried the edge of madness. This territory, these people, they belong to men strong enough to hold them, men willing to do whatever it takes. Arthur kept talking, drawing Van der Berg's attention while Michan worked her way through the tunnel. He could picture her moving through the darkness, using knowledge gained from years of careful observation. "You hurt Michan," Arthur said. "Why?" "Because she needed to learn her place. Because all of them need to learn their place." Arthur felt anger surge through him, hot and clean. This was what they'd been fighting. Not just corruption, but the belief that some people mattered less than others. That power gave someone the right to break whoever they wanted. "Her place," Arthur said carefully, "is wherever she chooses to be." Van der Berg's laugh was harsh. Pretty words from a man who's about to lose everything. That's when Michan made her move. Arthur didn't see it happen, but he heard the sounds. A brief struggle, Charles's voice calling out that he was safe, then silence that stretched taut as a bowstring. When Michan emerged from the barn, she was walking steady and straight. No limp, no fear, just the quiet dignity of someone who'd faced the worst and refused to be broken by it. Van der Berg came out behind her, his hands secured, his face sullen with defeat. Marshal Thompson's men took custody of him without ceremony. "How?" Arthur asked. "Knew he'd position himself near the ladder to the loft," Michan said. "Knew he'd be watching the front door. Knew he wouldn't expect anyone to come up through the floor." Arthur looked at her in the gathering darkness and saw something he'd missed before. Strength that had nothing to do with him, power that existed independent of his protection or approval. "You saved us all," he said. "We saved each other." 6 months later, Arthur stood in the main street of Tombstone, watching Michan unlock the door to her boarding house. The sign above the entrance read "Traveler's Rest" in elegant script, painted by Elena Vasquez, who'd expanded her business to include sign painting. The trials were over. Van der Berg and Bell had been convicted, along with most of their network. Williamson had been caught at the border and extradited back to face charges. The territory was healing, slowly but steadily. Arthur's ranch prospered with Charles as a full partner. John Marston had stayed on, working to rebuild the trust he'd damaged. The work was hard but honest, and that made all the difference. Michan walked down the street with her head high, greeting neighbors and conducting business with the confidence of someone who'd claimed her place in the world. When she saw Arthur, she waved with the casual familiarity of an equal acknowledging another equal. Arthur tipped his hat and smiled. The morning sun painted everything golden, full of possibility and promise. The territory stretched out before them, vast and complicated, and full of people trying to build something better from the broken pieces of what came before. That's how it should be, Arthur thought. That's how it had always been meant to be. And that is all to the story for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.